Welcome back to another video. Today I'm continuing with my spring sewing as well as some stash busting with this very cute blouse project. If you are new here, hi, I'm Olga and I make sewing content that is usually vintage inspired and sometimes a little bit nerdy. I have this challis here that has been in my stash for a few years now. It's this really big floral print that is a black base with really big yellow blooms and then also some lilac ones in between, and I have just about enough to make a short sleeve blouse, so that's what I'm planning for this fabric. I have a little sketch here of what I want to do. So this is the sketch. My idea is to make a simple bodice with puffy sleeves and a back button placket. As for the patterns that I'll be using for this, I'm going to go with my tried and trusted McCall's 8161. I love using this bodice pattern because I almost use it as a bodice block at this point because I think it fits me really nicely. It's easy to use, not too many darts, not too much like fussing around, and it's really easy to modify. At the back, I'm going to be adding about 5 centimeters of extra seam allowance to add a button placket, which will help to add like a little bit of vintage flair to this because obviously blouses in the 40s and even in the 50s really often buttoned down the back. As for how it closes and opens, I don't find back buttons really difficult. I actually find them easier than zippers. For me, this isn't like a compromise or anything. I know that for some people that can be a little bit hard to use. I really like button plackets at the back, so I'm happy to do that. As for the sleeves, I'm actually going to be using the same sleeve pattern that I designed for this top that I made on the channel last year, and this is just like a really big sleeve basically that I'm going to then gather to make it into a poofy sleeve. Hopefully it will work out with this challis fabric because it is more drapey than the cotton poplin that I drafted it for, but hopefully it'll still work out. I'm gonna go ahead and press this fabric because it is super crinkly and it really needs to be pressed before I start cutting out, and then we're gonna get started with the project. After I ironed the fabric, I folded it with right sides together, making sure my selvages are nice and even. It can be a bit frustrating to cut challis fabrics because they are so drapey, they just want to dance around, so I recommend you use lots of pins or pattern weights if you have them. Honestly, anything can be a pattern weight, but you know what I mean. As I mentioned in my intro, I'm doing a bit of a mashup here, so I'm going to be using the bodice and facing pieces from the McCall's 8161 pattern, and then I'm going to use the sleeves that I drafted. This includes the sleeve and the cuff. In the original video where I made these, I actually explained how I drafted them and I show you how to do it, so I'll leave that linked in a card in case you want to go and check it out. I'm going to add 5 centimeters of seam allowance to the center back seam, and I'm using my ruler, which is 5 centimeters wide. Makes it very convenient. I actually started marking this with that little chalk wheel from Prym, but it was very faint, so I switched to a Frixion pen in a darker shade. I also added the extra 5 centimeters to the center back of the facings. When everything was pinned, I started cutting out and marking. When I'm working with sensitive or more like temperamental fabrics like this, I like to mark the pieces as soon as I cut them, so I move them as little as possible. I cut out the notches and then I transfer any relevant markings as well. I've made this bodice enough times to know what markings I need and what markings I don't, so I'm transferring the darts obviously and the center back line. Another thing I do for fidgety fabrics is stitch marking, again, because it helps with how much they want to move around. Plus, I'll be needing the center back line for the button plackets, so I need this line to last throughout the sewing process, and the Frixion pen will come out when I press this. So stitch marking is the best option here, in my opinion. After I mark the piece, I'm also pinning the darts. The only other piece that needs marking apart from cutting out the notches is the front bodice, and that's only 2 darts, so the marking and pinning went pretty quickly. Next, I cut out my interfacing. I'm going to be interfacing the sleeve cuffs, the facings, and also I'm going to be adding a 2.5 centimeter strip of interfacing to the center backs to help add structure to my button plackets since I'm working with a challis. I started sewing the darts on the bodice pieces. I backstitch at the open end of the dart, and then I leave the thread tails long at the tip without backstitching. Then I tie the ends off and cut them to a couple of centimeters. And if you're wondering about my outfits, if I made it on the channel, I usually leave a card to the video where I made it. Here I'm wearing the blouse I made for my Celeste cosplay and my Hobbit inspired waistcoat. Anyway, while I wait for the iron to warm up to press the darts, I'm going to put in the gathering stitches on the sleeves. I'm using the longest stitch on my machine and adding 2 rows of stitching in the seam seam allowance of the sleeve cap and 2 at the cuff edge without backstitching. Then I pressed all my darts using my tailor's ham and tied off the ends of the thread and cut them like I said before. And while the iron is on, I also went ahead and fused my interfacing. Today I'm using my trusted Vilene Vlieseline H310. This is my favorite fusible interfacing, and I made use of all the little odd bits that I had at my stash to use here. I'll leave a link to it below in case you're in need of some interfacing as well. With all the prep done, I could start pinning things together to sew. I started by pinning the facings together at the shoulder seams with right sides together, matching the notches. Then I pinned the cuffs closed with right sides together. Next, I pinned the sleeves closed at the underarm seam with right sides together, matching the notches. And finally, I pinned the back and front bodice pieces with right sides together at the shoulders and sides, taking care to match the notches and using as many pins as I felt were needed to hold this flimsy fabric in place. I stitched those seams in one go, which saves on time and thread, making sure to backstitch at the start and finish of every single seam. When I had all of those seams sewn together, I got out my serger and serged all of the raw edges. If you don't have a serger, a zigzag stitch is fine on your regular sewing machine. A lot of sewing machines even do overlocking stitches nowadays, or you can use whatever method of seam finishing you prefer, like French seams or picking shears, whatever you like. I pressed the seams of the facings towards the back, and then I serged the bigger edge, which will need to be finished at some point, and I'd rather do it now when it's like a smaller piece. Then I pressed everything. I basically pressed all of the seams towards the back. Next, I pinned the facings to the bodice with right sides together, matching the shoulder seams and the notches. This blouse comes together really easily and quickly. I think with the filming included, I stitched this in about 3 hours. So even if you're a beginner, this could be a really good make for you too. I'm also going to pin the cuffs to the sleeves with right sides together, starting by matching the seams, but obviously I had to gather up the sleeve to fit the cuff. I tied off the gathering stitches on one side and pulled on the other. I found the center of the cuff, and then I'm pulling all of the gathers to that point. You could also spread the gathers around or do pin tucks or pleats. Now I'm going to sew those in place. These are trickier seams, so I take my time and make sure I'm smoothing the fabric to avoid tucks and puckers. I also went ahead and serged those seams, and now I'm going to press them. I'm pressing the seams of the cuffs towards the cuff with the help of my seam roll, and then pressing the seam allowance in on the raw edge of the cuff. Then I fold the cuff in so that the folded edge covers the seam allowances, and I press that in place as well. To press the facings, I used my tailor's ham, and I'm first pressing the facings away from the bodice as well as the seam allowances. And now I'm going to understitch the facings. To do this, I'm basically sewing the seam allowance to the facings really close to the seam. This is going to help my facing stay in place, but is not actually visible from the outside, so it gives you an invisible finish. After that, I press the facings to the inside, again using my tailor's ham. I've linked it below in case you're interested, as well as most of the tools that I use. I'll be tacking the facings to the seam allowances of the shoulders on the inside to further keep them in place. Now I'm folding the interfaced 2.5 centimeters of the back opening edges in so that the fabric is right sides together, and then I pinned the top along the facings. I had to trim my facings slightly, and then I'm going to stitch that along the top. I trimmed the seam allowance and clipped the corners, and then I flipped those interface sections to the inside, and that gives us a lovely finished edge at the top. I tucked the facings into it, and I'll tack it down later. Before I move on, I'm going to press that in place, as well as the button placket all the way along the back opening edges. Then I'm going to hand sew the folded edge of the cuff down. You could do this on the sewing machine if you preferred, but I like having an invisible finish. Now I can pin the sleeves to the bodice. I start by matching the underarm seams and the notches, and then I tie off the gathering stitches on one side and pull on the other until the sleeve cap is the same size as the arm side. Once I've done that, I pulled all the gathers to the shoulder. And then, of course, I repeat that for the other sleeve. Next, it's time to stitch those in place. Again, take it nice and slow. This footage is sped up by 4 times just for reference of how slow I'm actually going here. When the sleeves are in, I serge those seams and press them towards the sleeves. Then I'm going to start prepping the hem. First, I fold the 2.5 centimeter interfaced edge to the outside and pin that down. I'm going to repeat the same finish as for the top, but here I'm sewing 3.2 centimeters from the raw edge, which is the hem allowance indicated in the pattern. Once I've stitched that, I'm trimming it, only clipping the interfaced side. Next, I turn the interfaced edge back to the inside and press that in place. the hem will want to turn up as well, which is what we want it to do. So I'm using my seam gauge to double check that I'm pressing it at the right amount and just pressing that in place along the whole hem. This fabric may have a lot of flaws while sewing, but boy does it press nicely. After I've pressed the whole seam up the 3.2 centimeters, I went back over and pressed the raw edges into the fold to form the proper hem and press that in place again. And then I'm not really sure why, but I sewed the hem in place by hand. It didn't take too long, and yes, I do like an invisible finish, as I've said like 5 times in this video, but considering I'll be wearing this tucked in about 99.99% of the time, I don't really see why I care so much about the invisible finish on the hem, you know? But if you're looking to practice your hand sewing, seams like this are perfect, you know, the ones that don't really matter. It's finally time for the buttons. I'm starting by lining up the back opening edges along the center back line and mark where I want my buttonholes to go. I'm setting them 8 centimeters apart and using my seam gauge to ensure that they're all the same distance from the edge, and then the actual buttons I'm using to mark how big I need the buttonhole to be. Then I made the buttonholes on my sewing machine and opened them up with my seam ripper. I lined up the back opening edges along the center back again and used my buttonholes to mark the placement of the buttons. Last, I stitched these buttons in place using my sewing machine. These buttons are vintage, by the way. And then I was ready for the reveal. There we go. I hope you enjoyed the reveal. I enjoyed the reveal as well. It was very nice out. I'm really pleased with this blouse. I think it came out super, super cute. I think the puffiness isn't what I imagined it would be. It's a little bit different from the white blouse that I made for the DAL project, which I drafted this sleeve pattern for. So because of the type of fabric I used for this blouse, it sits a little bit different on the sleeve, but I actually really like it. It's different to what I was expecting or I was thinking it would be, but I still really like it. I love the fit. I think that this fabric is super flowy and comfortable. It's very cool. So I think this is going to be a great addition to my wardrobe for spring and really well into summer. I really like the buttons and I think they came out super cute. It is a little bit more like loose fitted than I usually make this blouse because I think I added a little bit too much seam allowance. So I should have added 5 centimeters from the center back instead of 5 centimeters from the seam allowance of the center back, if you know what I mean. So I ended up adding 5 plus 1.5 is 6.5 centimeters to the center back instead of just 5. But I think in the end, really because of the drapiness of this fabric, it like the end result is still really cute, and yeah, I'm still really happy with it. I love it. It's comfortable, great. I don't really have anything bad to say about it. I think the only issue that this fabric has is, for some reason, I made the dress before with the same fabric, and I had the same issue where the facings, no matter how much I stitched them down, didn't want to stay down. And I don't know why. I tacked them down at the shoulders and at the back. I understitched, but still the facing like kind of wants to move around. So I don't know what that's about, but it is a little bit weird. I think I'll have to figure something out. Overall, that's really the only flaw or like less good thing that this blouse has. I'm really excited to style it with a bunch of different things. I already have quite a few skirts, dresses, lots of things that I want to wear it with. So yeah, really great staple, great addition to my wardrobe, and I probably will make more versions of this exact blouse, but in different fabrics and different, you know, finishes and stuff. It's not the last you're gonna see of this one. Yeah, that's everything I have to say about this blouse for today. If you enjoyed my rambling, I guess, and, you know, whatever I taught you, if I taught you anything, maybe you would like to consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean a lot to me. And also maybe follow me on Instagram or TikTok. I'm more active on Instagram, but I'm active on both of them, so I will leave all of those linked below in case you want to go and check them out. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!